results from my doctoral dissertation, which involved developing a model of perceived underemployment among immigrants in Canada, with a particular focus on the predictors and consequences of underemployment. Before I start, I want to acknowledge my primary collaborator on this project, which was Vicki Esses, who was my doctoral supervisor. So as everyone in this room knows, Canada actively seeks out highly skilled, highly educated immigrants to meet our labour market needs. The majority of individuals who immigrate to Canada are considered economic immigrants, which means that they're selected based on their ability to contribute to Canada's economy. And yet we are not doing a great job of integrating these individuals into the labour market. So this is a fairly recent headline from the Globe and Mail, which describes how economists estimate that the Toronto region alone is losing about $2 to $3 billion a year because immigrants are not getting jobs that are commensurate with their skills and abilities. Importantly, researchers like Jeff Rice, who was actually the external examiner on my dissertation committee, suggest that the economic impact is only the tip of the iceberg. So in fact, underemployment has a lot of negative consequences for individuals, for their organizations, and as you'll see today, for Canadian society more broadly. Okay, so here's a brief outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to keep the introduction, the sort of literature review part of it, fairly short, just because I want to spend the bulk of my time talking about the current research. And then I'll end by talking about some practical implications, and I'll be interested in hearing your viewpoints as well. So as I said, although the majority of immigrants to Canada are selected based on their skills and ability to contribute to the economy, many of these individuals are underemployed. And by underemployed, I mean that they're working for a job for which their education, skills, and previous work experience are underutilized. Immigrants experience underemployment at rates that are substantially higher than non-immigrants. So here's one statistic for you. In 2008, the proportion of immigrants with a university degree who were working in a job that required only a high school education was almost 70%. The comparison among non-immigrants is around 40%. So first, as I mentioned, someone might possess more formal education than their job requires. So someone with a PhD might be working in a job that requires only a high school education. Hopefully that won't end up being me. Secondly, someone that may possess higher level work skills or experience than their job requires. So for instance, someone might have 20 years of work experience and then immigrate to Canada and end up in an entry-level position. Third, someone might be involuntarily, and the involuntarily part is important here, employed in the field outside his or her area of formal education or training. So someone with an engineering or medical degree might be in the service industry. Fourth, someone might be involuntarily engaged in part-time, temporary, or intermittent employment, and again, this involuntary component is important. And then finally, someone might earn wages 20% or less than in their previous job. So this dimension gets a little bit complicated when thinking about immigrants, because we would have to consider something like purchasing power parity, which gets complicated when doing all these transformations. So there's a couple things that I want to point out about these dimensions of underemployment. So the first is it's possible to think about these things dichotomously. And by dichotomously, I mean sort of a yes or no distinction. So either someone is underemployed or they are not underemployed. At the same time, we can think of these more continuously, so make more fine-grained distinctions about the extent to which someone is underemployed. So we might say, this person is underemployed a lot, very underemployed, whereas, this person is underemployed a little. And the second thing that I want to point out is that we can look at them objectively or subjectively. So by objectively, I mean an outside observer can look at someone's education and look at the education required by their job and see if there's a discrepancy. We can also look at these more subjectively, or ask people about their perceptions or whether or not they feel underemployed. Okay, so in my doctoral dissertation, my main focus was on perceived underemployment, although I was also focused on objective indicators, as you'll see, but my primary focus was on perceived underemployment, which I conceptualized as a psychological construct involving the perception that one is employed in a lower quality job than one's pre-migration jobs. I chose to focus on perceived rather than objective for two reasons. So the first is that I'm interested in looking at this from the perspective of immigrants, and they've largely been ignored through all of this. So typically we look at objective indicators. And secondly, as someone interested in psychology knows, people are fascinating, as we all know, and individuals are likely to think and act based on their perceptions of a situation, regardless of how accurate those perceptions are. Okay, so as I said, I'll just briefly cover some past research on underemployment. So there is some prior research on underemployment among immigrants, but the research that does exist has only looked at certain aspects of this phenomenon, which I'll highlight here today. Researchers have mainly focused on examining the prevalence of underemployment among different groups. So for instance, we might compare the prevalence of underemployment among immigrant men versus immigrant women, or first versus second generation immigrants. These studies are very descriptive in nature. So they tell us that underemployment exists according to labor market data, and they tell us the extent to which it exists in different groups. However, they don't really speak to the why it exists, the process issue. And that's what I was interested in. It doesn't really tell us much about the predictors and consequences. It just tells us it exists and this problem is out there. Researchers have also conducted cross-national comparisons of immigrant success. So for instance, examining whether there are cross-national differences in immigrant success among second-generation immigrants. And finally, there's been some really interesting research conducted using qualitative approaches, so interviews, conducting in-depth interviews with people that are underemployed. And these studies are interesting. They paint these really vivid depictions of what it feels like to be underemployed. But again, they don't speak really to this process issue. And there's some issues around how much we can generalize, because perhaps the researcher spoke with 10 or 20 people, but in a very specific region. So with this context in mind, the goal of my dissertation research was to develop and test a comprehensive model of perceived underemployment among immigrants. So here's a diagram of the model. I hope you can see the font at the back. On the left side of the model, I have, so these are the potential predictors and consequences. So based on a review of the literature, primarily with a focus on individual level, so not looking at sort of macroeconomic labor market conditions here. You can see the potential predictors on the left side. So I have demographic characteristics. So these are the categories. Within these categories, there are different variables. Objective indicators of underemployment, unemployment history, and credential recognition. And on the right-hand side, I have consequences, potential consequences of perceived underemployment. And one of the main contributions of this line of research was that rather than just look at consequences for individuals, I also looked at consequences for their organizations, their employers, and also for society more generally. A couple other things, I'll talk a bit about this later, but one of the things that's sort of implicit in this model is this notion that perceived underemployment is the path through which these predictors lead to these consequences. And the second thing that I want to point out is you'll notice on the back end of this model, the right side of this model, I have what's called causal explanations, and I'll get into this more later. But essentially, I was interested in looking at whether the explanations that people make for their underemployment situation determine whether or not they do in fact experience those negative consequences. So this just sort of reiterates the research questions I just mentioned. So the first main question, what are the predictors and consequences of perceived underemployment? Secondly, is perceived underemployment the path through which those objective indicators lead to negative consequences? And the third question, do the causal explanations that people make for their underemployment determine whether they experience negative consequences? Okay, thanks. So a little bit about the respondents. So I'm kind of time crunched. I'm eating into Livia and it's time here. So I'll just tell you a little bit about who the respondents were to my survey. So I conducted 3 studies, and I won't get into a ton of detail about them, but I do want to point out that the characteristics of the respondents were consistent, fairly consistent across the 3 studies. So all of my respondents were recent immigrants, and by recent I mean they had been living in Canada for less than 10 years. On average, it ranged from about 3 to 5 years. The average age was 39. Highly educated individuals, so about 80 to 90% of respondents had at least a bachelor's degree from outside of Canada. Many had master's, PhDs, professional degrees. In study 1, I recruited participants through a not-for-profit organization in London that provides a searchable database of immigrant job seekers in Ontario. So it's a great organization. Its mandate is to match highly skilled immigrants with employers that are looking to fill skills shortages. So he emailed out a bunch of people that had jobs. So of course, because I'm interested in underemployment, I need to find people that are working. So in study 1, I had 190 respondents. In study 2, which I used actually a previously collected data set from the region of Peel, they did a big labor market survey, I had 199 respondents. And in the third study, 75 respondents. And about a 50-50 gender split in all of the studies. Okay, so I don't have time to get into all my measures, but I do want to show you my measure of my most important construct, which is perceived underemployment. So participants were asked, so again, we want to know their feelings. Please indicate the extent to which you agree with these statements. So there was a bunch of statements, but here's a few samples. So things like, I feel overqualified in my current job, I'm overeducated, I feel underemployed on this job. Okay. So, turning now to the results. So I've taken out all of the statistical analyses today. If you have questions about them, I'm happy to answer them after, but I won't bore you with the numbers. It is late in the day. Okay, so what are the predictors and consequences of perceived underemployment? So I'll look first at the front end of this conceptual model. So again, the results that I'm going to show you are based across those 3 studies. So when we look across them, it was great, they were consistent. What do we know? Okay, so let's start with the predictors. So demographic characteristics. So this was a big surprise to me. So the red X means no, it did not predict. So we know that demographic characteristics predict objective indicators of underemployment. However, when it came to perceptions, they did not predict. So men and women did not differ. Age didn't matter. Length of residency in Canada did not matter. So this was a big surprise to us. Interesting. Okay, moving on to objective indicators of underemployment. So here, just to quickly describe how I measured these things. So we asked participants, what is your current job and what was your pre-migration job? And we had some kind research assistants go through these using the National Occupation Classification and code these jobs according to industry and skill level. And then we compared pre-migration and current job to look for differences in terms of whether or not they're still in the same industry and skill level change. No one was working in a higher skill level job now that they're in Canada. So we just had the 2. So these are all yes, no. So as we expected, and this is good, it's sort of proof of construct, people who are working part-time involuntarily are higher on unemployment, as are people who are not working in the same industry, people who are working in a lower skill level job, and wages, we just looked at wages in current job. I didn't get into purchasing power parity. And so wages were correlated with perceived underemployment. So people making less money feel more underemployed, as we would expect. Okay, and the last 2 predictors, unemployment history. So this is the length of time someone has spent unemployed in Canada. So people that are unemployed are at an increased likelihood of accepting a lower quality job to make ends meet. And also when you look at a resume with gaps, it sort of sends a signal to employers that this is potentially someone who's willing to work a lower quality job or for less pay. So as I predicted, unemployment history, so length of time spent unemployed, predicted perceived underemployment, as did credential recognition. So the extent to which you had longer unemployment periods, the extent to which your credentials were not recognized, you felt higher on underemployment. So, again, here's a slide that shows the potential predictors that I looked at, and here's a slide that summarizes the results. So the red dotted line between demographic characteristics and perceived unemployment illustrates that link was not supported through the studies. Okay, so let's look at the second half of the model, so the consequence side. So as I said, one of the contributions I made was looking at consequences for various stakeholders. So there's 2 consequences that I looked at that I described as being relevant mainly for individuals. And these are new variables that within the context of underemployment people had not yet looked at that I know of. So the first was perceptions of justice. And by perceptions of justice, I mean how fairly do you think immigrants are treated in the Canadian labor market? And I also looked at satisfaction with immigration decisions. So how happy are you with the decision you made to come to Canada? How much do you regret that decision? These sorts of things. So perceptions of justice, that has a yellow asterisk, which means that it wasn't supported here. So looking across everyone, this was not associated with perceived underemployment. However, it does come into play later, so keep it in mind. In terms of satisfaction with immigration decisions, so as we would expect, people who feel underemployed are less satisfied with the decision they made to come to Canada. Okay, in terms of consequences for organization, so here these are research questions that have been examined among non-immigrants, but I replicated those findings here with immigrants. So people that feel more underemployed, they want to leave their current organization. They want to leave, they're currently looking for another job, they're dissatisfied, and they don't feel very committed to the organization. And the last consequence I looked at, and this has, this really speaks to, I think, the success of Canada's immigration program. Is a really important consequence, which is, are people intending to leave Canada? So we know that people who immigrate in the economic class are more likely to leave Canada, but again, this process behind this hasn't been explored that much. So again, there's an asterisk here because when we look across everyone, perceived underemployment actually didn't predict intentions to leave Canada, but as you'll see in a minute, this is a really important outcome. And it is predicted. Okay, so looking back at the model and the consequences I looked at, here's the model that I found support for. So again, the two solid green lines indicate that those links were supported in the data, and the red dotted line means that when we look across everyone, that link was not supported. So putting the predictors and consequences together, here's the model I found support for through the 3 studies. Okay, any questions at this one? Or let's save them till the end, actually. Okay. Research question 2. So the second research question was, is perceived underemployment the path through which objective indicators of underemployment lead to negative consequences? So what do I mean by that? So if you look at this model, you might be thinking that objective underemployment, so for example, whether someone's working in a different industry now than they were pre-migration, predicts negative consequences. So if individuals, for example, aren't working in the same industry, you might expect them to be dissatisfied with the decision to immigrate to Canada. So one thing I was interested in looking at was, is perceived underemployment the path that sort of through which this happens? So again, I'm not getting into the statistics behind this, but if you have questions, you can ask me later. So I do want to mention that my data did suggest that the reason that objective underemployment leads to negative consequences is because of perceived underemployment. So in other words, if someone's not working in the same industry, it causes them to feel underemployed, which in turn causes these negative consequences. Okay, and finally, research question number 3. Do the causal explanations that individuals make for their underemployment determine whether they experience negative consequences? So this is a really important part of this. Change how they perceive that situation and interpret that situation. So this part of the project was informed by a but the premise behind this theory is that as we walk through the world, we constantly strive to understand the world around us by making these causal explanations for events and circumstances that happen in our life, including things that are perceived as successes and failures. So we're trying to understand them, and we come up with explanations. So typically when we make these explanations, the explanations we come up with are either things that are controllable or uncontrollable. So if you think about someone who feels underemployed and is thinking about, okay, why am I underemployed? Why am I overqualified for this job? For instance, they might say, well, it's because I have a medical degree that's not recognized in Canada. Well, that's out of their control. It's uncontrollable. In contrast, someone might say, well, I'm underemployed because I'm not proficient in English or French. Or maybe I didn't search hard enough on my job search. So those are factors that we can control, we can change. So why was I interested in people's causal explanations? Well, because the explanations that people make are really important because they influence our emotions and our behaviors. So research suggests that when we change people's explanations for failure from things that are uncontrollable to things that are controllable, it alters their behavior and it results in positive behavior change. So let me give you an example. So no one's looked at this yet in terms of underemployment, but they've looked at it in terms of interview performance. So if you look at a group of people that went through an interview, and some will succeed and some will not succeed. And if you look at the ones that fail, and you ask them why, you can sort of split them into two groups. The people that come up with an explanation that was outside of their control, so something like, well, the interviewer didn't like me, and those that come up with an explanation that was in their control. So something like, well, you know, I really didn't brush up on my skills beforehand, or I really didn't prepare enough. Well, what you find is that the ones who have controllable explanations, they are more likely to do things to change the situation. So they're more likely to sign up for interviewer training and to practice their interview skills, and ultimately to perform better on subsequent interviews. So going back to the model, for research question 3, I was interested in whether the link between perceived underemployment and these consequences depended on the causal explanations that people made for their underemployment. So, I mean, we saw earlier that perceived underemployment leads to negative consequences. However, this is not a one-to-one relationship. So not everyone who feels underemployed is going to say, oh, I want to leave my organization, I want to leave Canada, and all these things. So this is a way of sort of figuring out, okay, well, who is it that experiences those negative consequences, and who are the people that are, I'm underemployed, but I'm okay with that. So what did I find? So, when individuals do not believe that their situation is personally controllable, so in other words, when they feel that it's uncontrollable, perceived underemployment leads to negative consequences. And with these people, it leads to the perceptions of injustice and the intentions to want to leave Canada. So remember I said I'd come back to that. However, when individuals believe that their situation is personally controllable, so I can change this, this is in my control, that washes out. So perceived underemployment is no longer associated with negative consequences. So you can feel underemployed, but if it's in your control, you do not want to leave Canada. So I think this is really important. So going back to the model, so I'm not going to get into the details of all the variables, but this causal explanations are important when it comes to individual relevant consequences and society relevant consequences. However, they don't matter when it comes to organization relevant consequences. In other words, if you feel underemployed, you do feel dissatisfied with your job. So those links are really strong. And causal explanations don't matter. So looking at all 3 research questions together, here's the conceptual model that I found support for. Okay, so practical implications. So the findings I presented here today have implications for research on underemployment, some of which Vicki and I are interested in continuing to pursue. But more importantly, they have many practical implications. They have implications for organizations, which I won't be speaking about today. But today I'm going to focus on 3 implications that I think are particularly important. So the first thing that I hope to have demonstrated here today is that people's perceptions of underemployment are very important. So these are the crucial link between objective indicators of underemployment and consequences. What this means is that if an individual is working in a job that requires a high school degree, for example, she won't react negatively if she doesn't feel underemployed. And in contrast, another individual might not be considered underemployed according to objective indicators, but if she feels underemployed, they can expect her to experience negative consequences. So ultimately, it's people's perceptions of the situation that are driving their reaction. So rather than focusing solely on objective indicators, this research suggests that we also need to pay attention to people's perceptions. On a related note, the findings about explanations demonstrate the importance of understanding how people interpret or make explanations for their underemployment situation. So when someone feels underemployed, they're going to ask themselves why they're underemployed. And if they can continue to feel that the situation is in their control and they can do something about it, they're less likely to want to leave Canada, for example. And finally, these findings have a lot of implications around managing immigrants' expectations about the Canadian labor market. So this is something that Vicki and I have talked about quite a bit. So if expectations are too high and an individual does not get a job that fully uses his credentials, he may feel that the situation is out of his control and this might lead to negative outcomes. However, if an individual has more accurate expectations, so for example, understands that there might be challenges associated with getting a job commensurate with my skills, or maybe it's going to take some time. He may feel that his employment outcomes are in his hands. So if he encounters challenges or feels underemployed, maybe less likely to want to leave Canada. So this begs the question, well, how can we manage immigrants' expectations about labor market outcomes? So this is something that can be built into overseas orientation, into settlement information that's provided. To some extent, this is already happening. So for instance, the municipal portals often provide information about local, community-specific labor market challenges and opportunities. And this information can also be reiterated by programs delivered by immigrant employment councils and networks. And Vicki and I have some data that speak more to this issue of expectation violation and perceived underemployment. It's something we plan to look into further. And that's it.